Shalom, when the stuff so but giving no praise to how about Shem al Shah Bashem Kalkadash, the blonde the apostle great Milson, and honest to you brothers doing the work of the most in truth and in sincerity. Yahweh's real name of whom the world daily calls God Jehovah or Yahweh. His real name is Yahweh. His son's true name is Yahweh Shai. And when we pray Yahweh Ba Hashem Yahweh Shai, but meaning that and Sham, meaning names Yahweh in the name of Yahweh Shai. Real quick, well, actually, it won't be quick. This one, it's another one of these deep research things. So it's going to be a lot more reading, but Lord's always precepts come to mind. Bring it up, right? So the question asked to Gemini, which has that deep research feature, right? Like I said, it before it does take a lot longer to generate an answer, like 5 or 10 minutes, but when you look at, for instance, at the bottom of the article, you see that it's used a whole load of of sources here. I believe it's 67 in total. And you're looking at some of the stuff that it's going through so many different I mean, this would have taken a long time to compile manually, right? So it is very much a thing of yes, Esau uses these these we understand that he's going to use these tools to try and enslave and come up against us, right? But the Most High has basically allowed us to be able to make use of these as for the time being. Okay, so let me just grab this real quick. Yeah, so this is, which this is more so talking about just the things listed, right? But just wanted to touch on it, right? This is Sirach 39:27, right? So all things are for good to the godly, so to the sinners they are turned to evil, right? Because you can use certain of these things to for evil, right, and stuff like that, but we go and use it for good, for edification. So let's go into it, right? So now what I did this time, right, I exported it to my Google Drive, just so that I can highlight certain things. Otherwise, we are going to be here forever, right? So you can see there's 31 pages, right? So once again, what to say? The question asks, underscore the importance of the Strait of Hormuz. It says explain how it would affect the world economy if it was shut, and the impact it would have over a day, a week, a month, year, etc. Right? So it basically did its crunching, and basically compiled a thesis, if you will. Okay, so that's why once again it's like these tools, whilst we have them, might as well make use of them, right? So I'm gonna read a bit of the entry, but then I'm gonna start like jumping up and down. Right, so it says, it basically titled it as, and in fact, what I might do, I might zoom in to make things a little bit easier to read. So it says the Hormuz fulcrum, right? So I'll go over here. It says fulcrum. It says specifically the support about which a lever turns, right? It says one that supplies capability for action, right? It says so that's pretty much it. So it's basically something quite important, basically, right? It says modeling the global economic cascade of a choke point closure, right? So section 1, unrivaled artery of the global economy, right? It says the stability of the global economy is predicated on the uninterrupted flow of energy and goods through a handful of critical maritime checkpoints. Among these, none holds more strategic and economic importance than the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway is not merely a shipping lane, it is the single most vital artery for the world's energy supply. Its unique geography, the immense volume of resources that pass through it daily, and the intricate web of global dependencies it supports make its potential closure an event of unparalleled catastrophic significance, right? And the kind of reason why wanted to look into this and get a better understanding is because with the current situation that you're seeing over in between Israel and Iran at the moment, one of the things that is every now and then kind of mentioned is they could close the Strait of Hormuz, right? So it was this kind of report kind of goes into why it's important, but then also why it's very much a nuclear option for Iran, right? Because that country keep, oh, we can't let Iran get a nuke or whatever. I mean, this would be a nuke, right? And that we're kind of gonna get into just how catastrophic, right, closing the strait could be, right? And why it's something that very much they've not done so as yet. But then also want to touch on whether the elites could actually push for its closure, because we understand that at the end of the day they are the people that that behind the scenes, right? They're pulling the strings, right? Because at the end of the day they've gotten an agenda, right, that they want to fulfill, right? So this is Psalm 64, and we bring it into this tab, right? It says Psalm 64 and 2. It says, hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked, from the insurrection of the workers of iniquity. Right? And what you're seeing right now is rather, when you look at these elites, right, they are very much a secret council. They do things. They make policies behind closed doors, right? They're the real, they're basically trying to act like the Most High, right? Yeah, on the surface of it, people are doing X, Y, and Z, but behind the scenes, they're basically being controlled, right? Just in the same way that the Most High controls, right? And even on that, let's grab this. This is Proverbs 21. Right, and one, this is the king's heart is in the hand of Yahweh, right? And what's I was about to call him Nero, what's Nero Trump, right? Been referred to recently, right? King, right? No King's Day protests all over the world, right? But the Most High is ultimately in control, right? Whether it be the the shadow government, right, or the globalists, as what's this guy Alex Jones likes to say. Right, it says Job 5 and I'll read from 12. It says, he disappoints the devices of the crafty so that their hands cannot perform their enterprise. Right, and their ultimate enterprise is that MOTB and pushing it out to the to the world. Right, so it's a thing that you're seeing, basically seeing how these different things happening in the world and how it's leading towards the MOTB, right? He says he taketh the wise in their own craftiness, right, and the counsel of the forward, right, is headlong, right? And let me just check real quick in my my other tab, which call that in the NLT. Let's see if we can get any more from that, right? There we go. So let's bring that in, right? So Job 5 in the NLT, where we're reading from? We're reading from 12, right? So it says, he frustrates the plans of schemers, so the work of their hands will not succeed. It says he traps the wise in their own cleverness, so their cunning schemes are thwarted, right? And what he is doing with all of these different plans and different movements of stuff, right, is very much a thing of is very much a thing of it's a scheme, right? It says he traps the wise in their own cleverness, so that their cunning schemes are thwarted. They find it is dark in the daytime, and they grope at noon as if it were night, right? So yeah, let's carry on, right? So back in the article, rather than the report, so it says this narrow waterway is not merely a shipping lane; it is the single most vital artery for the world's energy supply. As we read, that says to comprehend the scale of a shock, shut down. The scale of the shock a shutdown will represent. It's first necessary to understand the Strait's fundamental role in the modern world, right? A role defined by its physical constraints, the lifeblood of energy it carries, the nations that depend on it for their survival, and its long history as a geopolitical flashpoint, right? So this is a geographic and navigational profile. So the Strait of Hormuz is a channel that provides the only sea passage from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, linking it with the Gulf of Oman and subsequently the Arabian Sea and the wider Indian Ocean. Geographically, it separates. In fact, I don't understand how I've not got a picture of this. Real quick. Okay, so I'm just loading it up. Right, so no, I don't want to do that. I want to do this. Open, and here we go. Right, so you just see it there, right? So you see it there. This little tight point, right? So very tight. But you're seeing these basically these regions here, right? They use this to get out. Okay. And it's funny because even now I'm looking, a lot of these are like from this particular clip, rather image, India Today, is from 5 hours ago. You're seeing one 2 days ago, a day ago, 2 days ago, 3 days ago, a day ago. So it's very much a thing that is what you call it, of conversation, right? But like I said, it'll be very interesting to see how what whether this would actually be this particular nuke, if you will, would actually be used, right? Because if it is, as we're about to read, it's going to have a huge geopolitical impact, right? So it says the strait itself is approximately 90 nautical miles, right? With its width varying from as much as 60 miles to a critical choke point of just 21 nautical miles at its narrow point. So I asked this robot what the difference between a nautical mile and a regular mile is. Right, it says the key difference is what they measure and where they're used, right? So it says I'll just get to a point, right? So it says a nautical mile is longer, it's directly linked to the globe, right? It says 1/60th of a degree of a latitude, right? It's mainly used at sea and in air because it is more convenient for navigating the curved surface of the earth. So a nautical mile is basically 1.15 regular miles, which a regular mile is referred to as a statute mile, right? It says the earth is roughly a sphere. To help navigate it, early sailors and cartographers so I just need to make a note to remind myself to do something. So it says the Earth is roughly a sphere. To help navigate it, early sailors and cartographers divided it up into a grid, 360 degrees of latitude from pole to pole. Each degree is divided into 60 minutes. So 1 degree is 60 minutes of latitude, and 1 minute of latitude is 1 nautical mile. Right. So that's basically just the difference there. So we carry on. It says, while the overall width is constrained, the navigable channel for the world's largest ships is far narrow. Right, to maintain the immense volume of traffic and enhance safety, the International Maritime Organization has recognized a traffic separation scheme. It says this scheme, right, and this is important, this scheme funnels maritime traffic into designated inbound and outbound lanes, each just 2 miles wide, right, separated by a 2 mile wide buffer zone. This system, while essential for orderly transit, has the profound strategic consequences of concentrating the world's most valuable maritime assets, very large crude carriers, right, and liquid natural gas tankers, into highly predictable and exceptionally narrow corridors. This predictability makes them acutely vulnerable to disruption, as any hostile actor doesn't need to control the entire 21 mile width of the strait, but merely needs to threaten the 2 mile wide lanes to achieve disproportionate effects. Right, basically saying, people may be like, oh, it's too, it's gonna be a lot of thing to control. But it's basically saying, actually, when you look at the routes, you don't really need to do too much, right? It goes on to say the legal status of the strait adds a layer of complexity and potential friction. Right, in 1959, Iran expanded its territory, etc., etc. But basically it goes into that. So it's Tehran asserts that foreign warships, submarines, and nuclear-powered vessels must obtain permission before exercising what it defines as innocent passage through its waters. The US and other naval powers do not recognize this claim and regularly contest it by sailing warships through the strait, creating a persistent source of legal and military tension that could serve as a pretext for confrontation, right? So yeah, let's go into some, basically what's, some of the stuff that, is sailing out from this particular, particular strait, right? It says the Strait of Hormuz is, right, 1.2, right? The daily flow, quantifying the energy transit. The Strait of Hormuz is, without exaggeration, the world's single most important energy choke point due to the sheer volumes of hydrocarbons that pass through it every day, right? Because that's what this world is built off of, right? So it says crude and petroleum, right? In 2024 period, the daily flow of crude oil, condensates and other stuff, right? Through the Strait average between 20 and 21 million barrels per day. It says this volume represents approximately 20 to 21% of the world's total daily petroleum liquid consumption. Put differently, 1 in every 5 barrels. So the volume is so immense that it accounts for more than a quarter, and by some estimates, up to a third of all global seaborne oil trade, right? And LNGs are something that's a little bit more interesting as well, right? So it says the Strait's importance to the global natural gas market is just as critical, if not more so, due to a lack of alternatives. Right, the waterway is the exclusive transit route for all LNG exports from Qatar, one of the world's largest LNG producers, and the UAE. Combined, these exports account for approximately 20 to 21% of the total global LNG trade in 22 to 24. Unlike oil, which for a limited number of bypasses pipelines exist, there are no alternative routes to bring these massive volumes of LNG to market. Right, a closure would therefore instantly remove a fifth of the world's LNG supply from the market with no possibility of rerouting. Right, so you're understanding now, like, just what kind of impact it would have to, rather it would cause to close this particular strait, right? Just when you're basically saying you can actually just take away 20% of energy productions. It's like, okay, so Iran doing that would actually cause some kind of a major issue, right? However, right, it's because we're kind of going to touch into why that lever isn't necessarily pulled, and why very much I keep saying it is very much the nuclear option, right? So the vulnerability of the LNG market, in fact, so I've not read this, have I? Right, it says other goods. Says a closure would not only trigger energy crisis but also paralyze the non-energy trade of the entire Gulf region, causing severe disruption to the global supply chain that rely on these hubs for regional distribution into South Asia and East Africa. Right, it says the vulnerability of the LNG market merits special emphasis. The global oil market, while heavily reliant on Hormuz, possesses two key buffers: a global system of strategic petroleum reserves, right, and a limited but functional network of bypass pipelines. The global LNG market has neither. There is no such thing as strategic gas reserves, right? So you hear about the U.S. strategic petroleum reserves, which we're going to touch on a bit later, as well, right? But there's no such thing for LNG, right? It says markets for LNG are also historically less liquid and flexible than the global oil market. Consequently, the sudden and total removal of 20% of the world's supply will trigger a gas crisis of unprecedented severity, with consequences potentially more intractable than the oil shock itself. Gas dependent economies in both Asia and Europe would face an immediate and unsolvable shortage, leading to blackouts, industrial collapse, and a humanitarian crisis during winter months, right? So you once again building that picture of just the kind of issues that closing this strait would cause, and you kind of see here, right? About uh, the different the different countries, key importers as well, that basically are reliant, right, on this, right? So if we're talking about LNG, India, Japan, South Korea, and Europe are gonna, well, eight also says China, sorry, sorry, what was this? No, that's in a different thing, right? So yeah, LNG, India, Japan, South Korea, and Europe, right, in these places where you get major manufacturing, right? So the global web of dependency, right? So for Iran, the dependency is absolute, and this is the thing, right? In fact, maybe I might read a bit further up, right? And this is the reason why it this lever isn't necessarily just pulled straight away, right? Because the although yes, it would affect everyone else, right? It actually is a major it's a major issue for Iran itself, Right, so it says the flow of energy through the Strait of Hormuz creates a complex global web of mutual dependence, linking the economic fortunes of producing nations in the Gulf with industrial powerhouses thousands of miles away. The economies of several major OPEC members, Saudi, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran, as well as Qatar, are fundamentally structured around the export of hydrocarbons, the vast majority of which must pass through the Strait. For Iran, the dependence is absolute, with its major oil export terminals located in the Persian Gulf, right, and the lack of sufficient domestic refining capacity, it relies on the Strait not only for all of its export revenues, but also for essential imports, right, including gasoline and industrial raw materials. A closure of the Strait, while a strategic threat it can leverage against others, would be an act of profound economic self harm. Right, so because that was one of the things before kind of looking into this, maybe like, yeah, man, once again, yeah, man, they could just close the Strait, but it's like you start looking into it, it's like, nah, they can't really, right? Because right now, what you have at home, right, is you have the rather in Iran. I mean, so for Iranians at home, you have the Iranians basically saying F Israel, F Israel, etc., etc., etc. Right? So the Iranian powers have the people on side, right? But closure of the Strait, right, means that now you're having blackouts. Right now you're having social unrest, and that then becomes a problem, right? And one of the things we're going to touch on in this is there is going to be social unrest, right? Should that Strait be closed, right? There's going to be social unrest because of the profound impacts, right, it will cause, right? Now there are a load of presets, but they kind of come in a lot further down, but just because I've not got one in a while, just gonna grab this just on that point of social unrest, right? This is Second Ezra 15 and 16. It says, they shall be sedition among men, and invading one another. They shall not regard their kings nor princes, and the course of their action shall stand in their way, right? Because we are going to get to that point where the citizens of these different states are going to start coming up against their against the powers of their own country, right? So it would be not just economic suicide, but social. I'm trying to think of the word political suicide as well, right? Because it's gonna once you have rolling blackouts, there's no food and stuff like that. People are gonna start turning their attention away from, once again in this example, Israel, right, and start looking at the leaders of Iran itself, right? But then also that's where you get this thing of with the elites, maybe that is what they want, because that's what they keep saying, right? They keep saying one of the goals is to cripple the Iranian regime and stuff like that, which this could very much be a way to do that. Okay. So carrying on, right, it says this is something that I found rather interesting, right, this point. Right, so the US's shale revolution has dramatically increased domestic production and slashed American reliance on Gulf oil. US crude imports from the region fell by a half between 2018 and 2022, accounting for only 11% of total crude imports and a mere 3% of total US petroleum consumption in that year. This creates a stark paradox. The US, through the formidable presence of the US Navy's Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain, continues to bear the primary military and financial burden of guaranteeing the security of the Strait of Hormuz. Right? However, the primary economic beneficiary of this American security umbrella is no longer the West, but Asia, and specifically America's chief geopolitical and economic competitor, China. So that's the thing. So, and this is why I keep kind of, and once again, not saying that this would happen, just theorizing and stuff like that, right? Is, why it may be the elites that will basically do a thing where they actually will make it such that, this particular strait gets closed, right? Whether by staging an event, right? Because right now the US is sending out an old aircraft carrier into the region, right? But this aircraft carrier is basically due to be decommissioned next year. Now you get a lot of people online that are basically keep mentioning the USS Liberty, right? USS Liberty incident, right, where basically you had a US, basically Israel, destroyed a US aircraft carrier, right, and basically just got away with it, right? So it says USS Liberty incident. The USS Liberty incident was an attack on the US Navy technical research ship, right, spy ship, right, USS Liberty, by Israeli Air Force jet fighter aircraft, right? And let's see if it just summarizes. So 34 killed, 171 wounded, right, and one ship heavily damaged, right? So they've done it before, right? So then it's kind of like, a lot of people right now would just basically saying, wait, hang about, you're sending in this old aircraft carrier, which is just going to be a sitting duck, because that's what aircraft carriers are nowadays. They're just sitting ducks, right? Are you going to stage an event, right? Once again, not saying that that will happen, right? But, there's going to be certainly something, right, where, because we understand this, right, that, America is going to be in these last days isolated, right? Because you think about as well what they did with Nord Stream 2, right, where basically America blew up Nord Stream 2, forcing Germany to look elsewhere for energy, right? So now would America go and basically create an issue where the Strait of Hormuz is no longer in use, and force people to start, other nations to start relying on America for energy production? Possibly, right? So Obadiah, and in a sense, because there is going to be a reason why these nations do turn on America, right? Once again, if you're German, and with the energy situation, right, China is now out competing Germany in terms of production, because China can still get that cheap energy from Russia, and Germany can't. And when you're talking about manufacturing, energy is really important, right? It says Obadiah 1 and 7 says, all the men of thy confederacy have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee and prevailed against thee. They that eat thy bread have laid a wound under thee, and there is none understanding in him, right? So we understand that there is going to be a turning point where nations are just going to be like, look, man, F America, right? And when you look, I'm looking at the time, just like, and we're basically nowhere. We're still at the top here, so I'm going to try to read faster and that, right? But as we go through this article, you kind of see just the effects closing that that strait would cause. I mean, even just reading it, 20%, right? That's a lot, right? So then you kind of look at this graph here, right? This is rather this table, right? Dependency on the Strait of Hormuz, right? So it says major importers, right? China, right? 55% of crude oil, of crude imports from Persian Gulf. So that's one of the reasons. And it goes, so China's economic stability is directly tied to the security of the strait, and that's why one of the things you hear, right, was China immediately coming out and saying, yo, behave, behave. We don't need no trouble right now, right? But then you look at here the major importers at the bottom, right? You see United States, right, at roughly 3% of total petroleum consumption, right? US has achieved relative energy independence, altering its strategic calculus, right? So really, that no longer affects America in the same kind of way if they basically did, if the strait is closed, right? It's a very different ball game now, right? So we look at 2-1, Iran's asymmetric doctrine, right? So then I looked, asked the robot, right? Summarize what is meant by asymmetric warfare. It says asymmetric warfare refers to conflict between two sides that have unequal military strength, tactics, resources, or tactics. Instead of fighting head to head in traditional battles, the weaker side uses unconventional strategies to exploit the stronger side's weaknesses. These tactics may include guerrilla warfare, the T word, cyber attacks, insurgency, propaganda, and psychological warfare. Right, the goal is often to wear down the stronger opponent over time, avoid direct confrontation, and gain political, psychological, or moral advantages. In short, asymmetric warfare is when a weaker force uses unconventional tactics to counter a stronger, more conventional army. Right. So we come back here. So it says this does doctrine does not aim. It says Iran cannot compete with the U.S. Right. So it says this doctrine does not aim to defeat the U.S. Navy in open battle, but rather to deny it access and make the Strait impassable for commercial shipping through a multi-layered defense in depth strategy, right? And it talks about mines as the primary advantages of mines is psychological. The confirmed presence of even a few mines, right, or a single successful strike on the tanker would force all commercial traffic to halt, right? And then yeah, we're even gonna touch on this a bit further down as well, right? So oh yeah, then they've got ballistic missiles which are difficult to defend against, which is why people are saying what's the word? Which is why people are basically saying them sending out this new, I think, what's it called, man? Nimitz, I think it is. All right, which once again people are like, wait, that you're about to uh um Slovakia, you're about to decommission this particular ship, right? So this is USS Nimitz, Nimitz, right? So carrying on, right? So it says the narrow confines of the Straits shipping lanes leave large, unmaneuverable tankers with little room to evade such attacks. Right, it's a seizure and sabotage. So such actions, even if sporadic, can achieve strategic effect by driving insurance costs to prohibitive levels and convincing shipping companies that the risk of transit is too high. So once again, as the picture is building, right? You can see how this would affect, right, long term, just the world in globally. So the most potent weapon in this arsenal is not military but financial, right? One of the names that got mentioned, right? So it says or the widely public, a single successful missile strike on a the very large container, whatever, a confirmed mine detonation, or the widely publicized seizure of a tanker would be enough for the global maritime insurance market incented at Lloyd's of London, which the brother Shakala and myself basically we did brother basically put together a a review into the Lloyd's of London, right, and how pivotal they were in basically creating insurance products for those devils, basically transporting Jake from the west coast, right, on them ships. Right, it says without insurance, no reputable shipping company would risk a vessel and cargo worth hundreds of millions of dollars, nor would they be able to secure financing or find a crew willing to make the voyage. Right, right. It says this insurance weapon can achieve a de facto blockade almost instantly. Right, so imagine you don't even really need, and this is what I was saying about the point where it could be a case where they could stage it, say it was Iran and yada yada yada, right? But immediately, when the insurance guys are like, look, we're not gonna even insure this. This is just too high a risk, right? Then immediately all of that shipping stops, and there's a cascade of issues that happens almost immediately, right? So this insurance swap can achieve a de facto blockade almost instantly, shifting the battlefield from the high seas to the financial markets of London and New York. Right, it says Iran's primary objective in the closure scenario is therefore not to defeat the Fifth Fleet, but to terrorize the global insurance industry, a far more achievable goal. right? So then this is the problem that Iran faces, right? It says deterrence versus self-destruction, right? It says a closure is not a first strike option, but is widely seen as a last resort or retaliatory measure, a card to be played only under the most extreme circumstances, right? It says the most cited trigger is a major conventional military attack on Iranian territory, particularly a strike aimed at its nuclear facilities or critical command and control infrastructure, which is what we've seen, right? Which is what we've seen. And when we read, I believe we read it up further on about how basically the US deems it a red line, right? Which makes us think of this. This is Jeremiah 49 and 20. So, like, let me explain that point. The US deems the closure of the Strait of Hormuz as a red line, right? So then when we are then looking at Jeremiah, so the fact that Slovakia. Let me try that third time lucky. So the US has basically said closing the Strait of Hormuz is a red line. This is then going on and saying that one of the reasons why Iran could close it is a strike on the Iran's nuclear facilities and stuff, which you've seen, right? So if Iran then does close it and America then does come in, right, it just proves what the scripture says, right? Which either way, what we're seeing is a proving of the scriptures, because America is the main reason why these those small hats just act so brazen, right? This is Jeremiah 49 and 20. It says, therefore hear the counsel of Yahweh that he hath taken against Edom, and his purposes that he hath purpose against the inhabitants of Teman. Surely the least of the flock shall draw them out. Surely he shall make their habitations desolate with them. Right. So basically, yeah, going into the going into how basically it's going to be these small hats that are going to pull America into this into this war. Right. So it goes on to say yeah, so continue on. It says another potential trigger is the success of a maximum pressure economic campaign that effectively strangles the Iranian economy to the point of collapse. Right? If Iran is already suffering the full economic consequences of being unable to export its oil, the leadership might reason that it has little left to lose by ensuring that no one else can export theirs either. Right? This logic is encapsulated in the oft-repeated Iranian mantra: if our oil doesn't pass, the oil of others shall not pass the Strait of Hormuz either. Right? And there's points that goes into the economic suicide pill. Right? The most powerful factor deterring Iran from closing the strait is the devastating impact it would have on its own economy. Iran is critically dependent on the waterway for its economic survival. Oil export revenues account for an estimated 85% of all government revenue, right? So obviously they're not just going to shut themselves out. Right? So furthermore, due to significant insufficient domestic refining capacity, Iran is a major importer of gasoline and other refined products, all of which arrive by sea through the Gulf. A closure would thus sever the regime's primary source of income, whilst also cutting off essential imports needed to run its economy and placate its population. It's what we touched on earlier on, right? When we read Second Ezra's in regards to basically doing it right. Right now the Iranian population is just looking at Israel like, man, we need to do XYZ. Whereas if it then starts having issues at home, then the public's opinions and eyes start going to the Iranian government, right? Which once again is actually in Israel and but based in Israel's interest for that to happen, right? The China facts, right? It says the largest single importer of energy transiting through the Strait of Hormuz, right? So basically, Iran's in a situation where a strategic partner is highly dependent, right, on energy coming through the Strait of Hormuz. So then it will be a thing of, they may not be too inclined to do so. Right, it says, however, the moment the threat is acted upon, its value as a deterrent is destroyed. The act of closure would trigger the devastating economic consequences for Iran itself and would almost certainly provoke a massive international military response aimed at reopening the strait and potentially crippling the Iranian regime. All right. So it says the international response framework 2.3 says The US has consistently and publicly stated that any attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz would be viewed as a hostile act, crossing a red line that would provoke a military response, right? And that is the way and America moves, right? This is Jeremiah 50 and 23. It says, "How is the hammer of the whole earth cut asunder?" Now, the thing that I wanted there is that point of the hammer, right? You can jump also in the set to Psalms 140, right? Constantly. In fact, I'll do that now real quick, and I'll come back. All right, so Psalms 140, right? Because what's the saying in the world? Everything to a hammer looks like a nail, right? So it says Psalms 140 and 1, "Deliver me, O Yahweh, from the evil man. Preserve me from the violent man, which imagine mischiefs in their heart. Continually are they gathered together for war." Right? So it's nothing for these guys to just be like, "Oh, a war," right? Why? Because the military industrial complex is such that people are making bank when there's a war. So we carry on, right? It says Jeremiah 50:23, "How was the hammer of the whole earth cut asunder?" Right? So America right now is the hammer of the whole earth, just going around, just hammering things into place, right? But however, it's going to be cut asunder and broken, right? And yeah, so let's carry on. So how was Babylon become a desolation among the nations, right? So continue on. Geopolitical complexities, right? It says at the same time, the major Asian importers, China, India, Japan, and South Korea, while having the most to lose from a closure, lack the independent power projection capabilities to reopen the strait themselves. They will be forced to rely on and support a US-led military effort, creating a complex and potentially fragile wartime coalition. Okay, and as we read before, China is more aligned with Iran than it is with America. Right, it says section 3, the economic cascade, right, timeline of impact. It says the impact will propagate from financial markets to the physical, economic, with devastating speed and force, right? Which is why, you think about, just how quickly things can change. Right, we remember the CV, right? One day everything was cool, then there was a bit of, we're hearing about something from China, and then the next thing you knew, right, the streets were empty, the skies were clear, right, everything, right, that and that was only a matter of time. But this is basically saying that this would be quick, right? Scripture that's coming to mind is Habakkuk 2, right, and 3 says, "For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie." So these prophecies are to come to pass when they're meant to come to pass, right? It says, "Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry," right? So tarry, this word here, basically delay, right? This is H309, a car, right? It says to procrastinate, right? So they won't be late, as you see, slack, right? In the in the flesh, it may seem like it's taken a while, but these things can come quick, and it can come quicker than you think. Right, because the economic impact of such a thing would cause, as you see here, devastate. It will be devastating, right? So this is the first 24 hours, panic and market seizure, right? It says the moment a closure is confirmed, whether by military action or a credible Iranian declaration, right, global oil markets would experience a price shock of historic proportions. Brent crude, the global benchmark, would likely surge by 50 to 100% or more within the first hours of trading. Conservative analyst models project an immediate jump from a baseline of $75 per barrel to a range of $120 to $150 per barrel. So imagine what you're paying at the pump now, right, and then double that, right, which is crazy. It says, however, the sheer scale of the disruption, removing 20% of global supply, has led some analysts to project a far more extreme outcome, right, citing the precedent of the 73 oil embargo, which involved a much smaller supply cut but caused prices to quadruple. Right, some models forecast a potential spike toward $200 or even $300 per barrel as the market grapples with an unprecedented supply deficit. Right, and once again with what the elites are trying to achieve, which is max pain, right, and then also order out of chaos, right. I would probably, me personally, speak as a man, I would lean more, if this were to happen, to some of these numbers, if not higher. Okay, so this is financial markets, right? It says a classic flight to safety would ensue, right? With capital pouring into traditional safe haven assets, the price of gold would spike, right? The US dollar would strengthen significantly as global investors seek liquidity and security, right? Because ultimately, gold is what real money is, right? So this is Genesis 13 and 12 and 2, right? It says, and Abraham was very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold, right? So that's real riches according to the scriptures. Okay, so we'll carry on, right? It says maritime sector freezers. It says maritime insurers in London and elsewhere would either withdraw coverage for vessels in the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman entirely, or raise war risk premiums to levels that are economically prohibitive. So basically, nothing's going to be moving, right? It says this creates a de facto blockade instantly, right? Driven by financial risk management rather than naval patrols, and it would occur long before any military coalition could organize a response. Okay. Then it goes physical supply disruptions. So similarly, LNG import terminals would face the prospect of their supply chains running dry, threatening electricity generation and industrial activity in gas-dependent nations, right? And then it talks about strategic petroleum reserves, right? So I looked into a bit more of that. This is what is the current asked this other robot, what is the current state of the U.S. Strategic petroleum reserve, right? So it says the capacity roughly 714 to 727 million barrels, right? Stored in our Gulf Coast, stored in 4 Gulf Coast salt cavern sites, right? And this drawdown rate is up to 4.4 million barrels a day, which basically gives around 90 days, right? So current inventory level, right, as of June 6th, right, the SPR holds approximately 402, so just over half, right? And yeah, that's about it. And one thing that's interesting, it says, where was it? Yeah, it would to restoring the reserve to pre-2022 levels will take several years and tens of billions of dollars. Okay, so let's carry on. Right, it says diplomatic. So going back to what's this section called again? Right, economic cascade, a timeline of impact. Right, so then we look at like policy scramble, right? Diplomatic and military mobilization. It says the crisis would dominate the global political agenda. The UN Security Council would convene in an emergency session, likely passing a resolution demanding the immediate reopening of the Strait and condemning the act of closure. Behind the scenes, diplomatic channels would be white hot. The US, Europe, and especially China and India would exert immense pressure on Iran to reverse course. Simultaneously, the US Department of Defense would order a full mobilization of naval assets. The US's Fifth Fleet would be placed on its highest alert, and additional carrier strike groups, bombers, and mine clearing assets would be ordered to deploy to the region. Public statements from the White House and Pentagon will make it unequivocally clear that the US is prepared to use military force to reopen the waterway, setting the stage for a potential armed conflict. Right, it's a sustained price shock and inflation. Says the cost of gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and home heating oil would soar, directly hitting household budgets. Right, so we can get what do we want? I'm trying to remember how it's. Whoops, right. This is Second Ezra 6 from 22. So suddenly shall the sown places appear unsown, the full storehouses shall suddenly be found empty, right? Because that's what you're gonna start seeing, right? These different places where food stores and petrol stores, they're gonna be found empty, right? Should it then, which we know that it's gonna happen anyway. Like I said, this is just kind of like modeling, what is happening, what could happen with the Strait of Hormuz, and once again just touching on its strategic importance, but also why Iran hasn't pulled this lever. Okay, but basically it's gonna cause a whole load of pain, right? The cost of everything would would go up, right? And it would make it just prohibitively expensive. But it was another one that I was kind of more thinking on, but can't think of it right now. Is it this one? No, it's not that one. Can't think of it right now. Yeah. Right. So it says second Ezra 16:18. It says, and 70, woe is me, who will deliver me in those days? Right, the beginning of sorrows and great mournings, the beginning of famine and great death, the beginning of wars, and the power shall stand in fear, the beginning of evils. What shall I do when these evils shall come? Behold, famine and plague, tribulation, anguish are sent as scourges for amendment, right? Which, something like this closing can very easily cause a famine, right? Because we're going to touch. I don't think I highlighted it. In fact, actually, it's here, right? It says the impact industrial shutdowns, the impact on global industry will be devastating. Sectors with high energy intensity, such as chemicals, fertilizers, right, plastics, and heavy manufacturing, right, would face dual crisis of unbearable input costs, and some cases the physical unavailability of fuel and feedstock, right? And it goes on to say leading to widespread shutdown, furloughs, and permanent layoffs. Right, so basically, this would cause, what it says, major inflation, right? And so that makes me think of, well, grab this one. This is where is this? Revelation 6:6. It says, and I heard in the midst of the four beasts say a measure of wheat for a penny, right, and three measures of barley for a penny, right, which is, as this was broken down, it's going into like a day's wage, right? It says, see thou hurt not the oil and the wine, right? So this particular straight closing would have major effects, right? It would cause these different would you call it, these different shortages and closures and famines and stuff like that, right? But once again, as just saying, this is just more modeling, not saying that this would this closing of the strait would actually happen. Okay. So it says, if it was to continue into months 2 to 12, right, so over the course of the year, the cumulative effects of the closure would unequivocally plunge the global economy into a deep and painful recession, right? It says historical analysis clearly shows that nearly every major US and global recession since 1970 has been preceded by a significant oil price shock, right? Says the 1973 embargo, right, which involved a supply cut of less than 4 million barrels per day, was significant to trigger a major global recession. It says a Hormuz closure, representing a supply shock 4 to 5 times larger, around 20 million barrels per day, would have a proportionally more catastrophic impact, making a severe global recession an inevitability, right? And as you see right now, people are already suffering financially. Okay, so then cutting this off would make it even harder. Right, so the primary mechanism for balancing the market would therefore be demand destruction. Right, the painful process of price. So this is basically how to mitigate failing demand. Right, it says the painful process of prices rising so high that they force consumers and industry to stop using energy. Right, so which once again would lead to that famine effect. This is how the demand for oil is so notoriously inelastic in the short to medium term. It takes a massive price increase to force even a moderate reduction in consumption. Right, this ensures that prices will remain at recession-inducing levels for the duration of the closure. Right, so the combination in humanitarian and political crises is the combination of soaring energy prices and cascading food price inflation driven by high fertilizer and transportation costs will trigger acute crises in the world's most vulnerable nations. And not just there, right now people are struggling. Right, so imagine this closing. This would push a lot of people way over the edge because people are already on the edge as it is. Right, says this would create a high risk of widespread social unrest, political instability, and state failure, potentially leading to mass migration and regional conflicts. Right, so I'll read again what we had in Second Ezra's 15. Right, so it says Second Ezra's 15 and what do you call it, and 16, right? For there shall be sedition among men, right, and invading one another. They shall not regard their kings nor princes, and the course of their action shall stand in their power, right? So that social unrest, is very much a thing that can happen, right? So it goes on to basically just list some of these things, right? Right. So then, yeah, it says if this so this is now going into buffers and bypasses. Right. It says if strategic petroleum reserves were used to replace this entire shortfall, the 1.2 billion barrels of readily available government controlled IEA stocks would be completely exhausted in just 60 days. Right, and then there's a point here on effective spare capacity, right? Because you've got these other pipelines, that people could be like, oh, but you could use this pipeline, you could use that pipeline, right? But it says the critical variable is not the total nameplate capacity of these pipelines, but their effective spare capacity, the amount of additional oil they can carry in a crisis, because they already have one. Rather, they're already in use. Then it goes on to like the overwhelming shortfall. So the math is stark and unforgiving. A disruption of 21 million barrels per day confronts a maximum bypass capacity of 4 million barrels per day. This leaves a daily unbridgeable supply gap of approximately 17 million barrels. Right? It says they cannot prevent a global supply crisis. Furthermore, in a full-blown conflict, these long exposed pipelines and their associated port facilities would themselves become high-value targets for missile or drone attacks, rendering their reliability uncertain when they are needed the most. Right? And then it goes to say there is no viable non-military solution to a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And once again, Iran knows this, right? Which is very much why I say it would for them be the it would then be a nuclear option, right, for everyone involved, right? So it goes into risk of escalation. It says Iran would likely retaliate not only within the Strait but also across the region, using its proxy forces in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen to attack U.S. forces, bases, and allies, right? So this is something that would definitely lead to a wider regional war, right? Which ultimately we understand that that's what's going to happen, because the Lord's when we speak about the value of Jehoshaphat, Yahweh Shaphat, right? Yahweh's judgment, right? It's referring to that Middle East region, right? But then it goes on to section 5. It says the world after Hormuz, right? And basically, should this happen, it would actually, and this is why, once again, I'm not saying it's gonna happen, right? Just presenting the information, right? The thesis, basically, right? That artificial Idumia has put together, right? But basically, why you can see why, although it's economic and political suicide for Iran to basically kind of close the strait, why they could stage an event where it does get closed, or what would happen if should it get closed, and it actually fits in with the greater agenda of these elites anyway, right? So it speaks about the great green, the great energy realignment, right? Accelerated energy transitions, right? So this crisis will trigger wartime mobilization policies to fast track the permitting and construction of solar farms. In England, you've got something called NIMBYs, right? NIMBY, right? Which stands for not in my backyard. Sure you get the same thing in the States and other places as well, right? But people that will be like, oh well, it's good, but we don't want it in our backyards, right? But as soon as the electric, you're doing what you see in Africa, after these African nations, something called like load sharing, where electricity is only on between X hours, right? Guess what happens? People move very quickly to solar, right? Which is why for instance, the country where I was born, Zimbabwe, if you can afford it, everyone gets solar, right? You get, solar for the electricity. Then you also get what's referred to as a water geyser, right? Which is basically like heated water from solar as well, right? It's basically like pipes up, on your roof, right? That gets heated by the sun, right? And then that's how you get energy. So even then, I'm just like, yo, this actually would be aligning with the elites plan, which the elites plan as well, because it talks about how the price of jet fuel would go up, petroleum would go up. But once again, what do these elites want? Right, they want these 15-minute cities. Okay. It says conversely, a torrent of so it's a shift in investment. The flow of global capital would realign dramatically. Investment in new long-term oil and gas exploration and production projects, particularly those located in geopolitically unstable regions, would collapse as they are deemed unacceptably risky. Right, so all of the good life people be living in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, that would come to an end, right? And then didn't highlight anything here, right? And this is another thing, right? The US as undisputed energy superpower. While the US economy would suffer greatly in a global recession, its relative position would be strengthened. With its own vast domestic energy resources, it would be insulated from the direct physical supply shock. It would become the supplier of last resort for allies in Europe and Asia, granting it immense and geopolitical leverage. The crisis would starkly illustrate the strategic value of North American energy independence and solidify the United States' role as the world's undisputed energy superpower. Right, so when I was reading that, I was like, oh snap. Right, which is what I kind of keep saying. It's like it will be very interesting to see how these next couple of days, weeks, months, whatever, play out. Right, but it's actually not against U.S. and Israeli interests to attack, right? Really, it's in Iran's interest not to attack. So it's actually a very, very interesting situation. So the conclusion says the core conclusion is therefore unavoidable. The global economy's profound dependence on the free passage of vessels through the Strait of Hormuz represents a systemic risk of the highest order. Addressing this vulnerability requires a concerted, long-term strategic effort focused on diversification, resilience, and diplomacy. To fail to do so is to leave the fate of the global economy hostage to politics and potential conflicts of one of the world's most volatile regions. Right, which once again is reading the scripture. That's the value of Yahweh Shaphat. Right, that's where we understand. There's going to be a large focus right there in the last days. Right, so yeah, I thought that was very, very interesting. Like I said, I'm a big fan of this deep research tool on Google Gemini. You see that it's just like from something that's was quite a short, they refer to these as prompts, right? What was quite a short prompt, being able to really better understand this geopolitical talking point. Because before this, you be reading articles and you're saying, oh, they could close it, close it. But then you understand by reading this that, yeah, they could close it, but the economic backlash, right, at home for Iran would be immense, right? It would actually help achieve Israel's goal of regime change, right? Because once again, when people can't get their petrol, when people can't do this, they start looking at the leaders, right? But then also just like understanding China's role in this, because once again, it was immediate, that rather when Israel started attacking, it was very immediate response from China being like, "Yo, let's chill." Right, but at first I was just like, oh, because of Iran and China have deals, but then it goes into the fact that actually, no, it's not just that kind of link, right? It's the fact that China gets a lot of its energy from that region through that strait, so they're not want for that to stop, right? Because once again, China is a manufacturing superhouse. They need to have that energy flowing nice and free. Okay, so I would definitely advise brothers to use the Gemini, hit that deep research button, and stuff like that. Because like I said, me personally, I very much enjoy just kind of going through this and learning more about this particular region. And Lord's was edifying to you as well. So as always, Lord's was edifying. Said until next time, we say Shalom.